Brooklyn Independent Television.
Hey, it's a big borough.
Will Brooklyn really go for it?
Why don't we just agree to disagree?
Yeah, that's really gonna fly in
Well,
Brooklyn.
that's a good question.
No. Listen.
That's exactly the point I wanted to make.
Testing is part of the fabric of an education all the way through a PhD program. There are assessments at all levels, including the state exams and no-stakes assessments that are tools to help students make academic progress, so they are college and career ready. Knowing what students have learned and where they have weaknesses is fundamental to teaching and learning. This is Intersect, and today we're talking high-stakes testing. I'm joined by Joan P. Gibbs, General Counsel for the Center for Law and Social Justice at Medgar Evers College, and Rachel M. Kleinman, Assistant Counsel of the Education Group of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having us.
So those weren't my words a few moments ago. That was actually a statement that we got from the New York City Department of Education when we contacted them about the subject of high-stakes testing, and more to the point, the lawsuit that is now pending, brought by the lead was the NAACP Legal Defense Fund.
Sure. First, to clarify, the NAACP itself is not actually involved. It's
right.
The NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and
Which
we're two separate organizations.
Entities.
Yeah. We've actually brought the complaint on behalf of a coalition of community groups. And in addition to, we also have Latino Justice ProDef is also co-counsel, as well as your organization.
So how did you come to be involved in the lawsuit at the Center for Social Justice at Medgar Evers?
Well, the center historically has did a lot of work in the area of public education for educational equity. We were one of the few organizations, for example, that spoke out against the police being placed in the schools, actually. Unfortunately, we were very few. And our director, Esmeralda Simmons, is a former member of the Board of Education, the old Board of Education. She's been, that's her issue. It's one of her big issues.
So I guess maybe I got a little bit ahead of myself. What is the lawsuit? Now that we know who some of the players are, what's the complaint that has motivated these groups to come together to say, hey, we have a problem?
Sure. So it's actually not a lawsuit. So that's the first thing to note. It's an administrative complaint that we filed with the U.S. Department of Education. They have an Office for Civil Rights. And so we didn't. This is not going to be in court. This is before an administrative agency.
So it's up for a review.
Yeah. So it's up to the Office for Civil Rights of the Department of Education to determine whether or not they're going to investigate. And we're pretty confident that they are going to investigate in this case. We've laid out a very thorough complaint. I think we've definitely laid it out well enough that they're going to be compelled to investigate. The issue itself is admissions to the 8 specialized high schools in New York. And the 3 that people are most familiar with are Stuyvesant, Bronx Science, and Brooklyn Tech, but there are actually 5 others. They're much smaller. Right. But the admissions to these schools right now is based on a 2.5-hour multiple choice test. That's it. Right. So, you can work as hard as you possibly can, get great grades, overcome all sorts of obstacles in your K through 8 education. None of it's going to matter. All that matters is how you perform
for 2.5 hours.
For 2.5 hours, yeah, on a multiple choice test, and a test that the city has never shown actually is either aligned with the curriculum, the public school curriculum, nor has it actually shown that it predicts anything about how you're going to do in one of these specialized high schools once you're admitted. So, it almost seems like a random test that these kids are spending 2.5 hours taking, and then it determines everything.
So, Ms. Gibbs, if we are looking at a 2.5-hour test that sort of is supposed to be the culmination of your whole K through 8 education, how is this a social justice issue? If it's supposed to be a test that sort of levels everything.
Well, it's a social justice issue because the test has a desperate impact on African American and Latino students. They are disproportionately not represented in the specialized high schools, but most notably Stuyvesant, Bronx Science, and Brooklyn Tech. And so it is our contention that, first of all, as Rachel has already said, the test hasn't been validated either as for validated for the purposes that it's used. It's also, we believe, fundamentally unfair to have your admissions determined by a single test. That's not done in other schools, similar schools around the country. Most of them use multiple factors. For example, they might use your grades, recommendations, but other factors, similar to the factors that when you apply to colleges. Colleges just don't use your scores on the SAT for admission, and so we don't feel that the Department of Education should do that for admission to the specialized high schools.
So is there a proposal that's come forward for what you would prefer instead of using this test across the board for all admissions? Is there another formula that you guys are proposing at the same time as putting the complaint in?
So I mean, the answer to that is that we didn't put forth any sort of specific proposal. We're saying that in order to assess merit, you really need to look at multiple measures. We think it's going to be really important that when the city and the state revise this system, that they have a lot of input from community groups, including the 11 that are included in our complaint, but other stakeholders. And so we want to make sure that that sort of community voice is in there when the decision is made about how to change it. But what we are saying is, all educational experts really agree at this point that you need multiple measures to have any sort of accurate assessment of merit. So start with the view that, okay, we're not going to only use a test and go from there, and then start looking at which sort of measures make the most sense in this particular case.
So some people are just good test takers. Like, that is a proven thing, no matter, I don't know if it's a left brain thing or a right brain thing, but some people just aren't. Like, in my own personal history, I know when I was in college, the most brilliant, if I could even say that, because she's probably going to see this and be a bigger jerk, but my friend who was the summa cum laude person who I happened to be personal friends with for 4 years in college was a horrible test taker. This woman could not take a test to save her life. Even going into graduate school, she was like Miss Rhodes Scholar. She had to have all these things to bolster her application, because just doing those entrance exams, the GRE, she looked like someone who just stumbled in after a night of partying. But there are those people, but by and large, we've been led to believe those are the exceptions, that tests do flatten things, because an A in one person's class isn't necessarily an A from a teacher down the hall, let alone from school district to school district or neighborhood to neighborhood. So really, is this test thing the best system that we have to make things even? Or how do we account for a principal's recommendation, or saying this kid was in the spirit or the pep club or something, in making things fair for kids to get an education in New York City?
Well, I think tests are, you're right, tests, some people are good test takers, some people are not. That said, though, one single test in 2.5 hours is surely not appropriate measurement.
For a 13-year-old
For a
person
13,
too.
14, or 15-year-old, because you can actually, I guess we're not focusing on it, but you can also test in the broad science and other schools in the 10th grade. So it's just, that is our problem with the specialized high school test, that it's just one, one measurement. Now, there are circumstances in which there is one measurement. For example, law schools, admission to the bar being one of them.
Right.
But I understand that they have even changed that. It used to be, but the focus on other things. And even that, I think, is not fair, in the sense that, you go to law school and you go and take the bar, and you pass or you don't pass, right?
Yeah.
I'd also just like to add to that, I think that the idea that there's an even playing field here with this test is also a false one. Especially because we don't have any evidence that this is aligned to the public school curriculum. The sort of best way to do well on this test is probably to do test prep. And access to test prep is obviously not even across the city. Certainly kids coming from private schools, kids whose parents can afford test prep,
Yeah.
all of that really gives you a leg up on how you do on the test. And we're not saying that test prep is the answer here, because we really still don't believe that even a test where everyone does have the same sort of access to it is going to be the best indicator of merit. But the idea that this is really an even playing field and a test answers all doesn't really have much to do with reality about what's going on in New York City.
So speaking of test prep, if we were to I could imagine a criticism would be, instead of focusing our energy on a complaint or all of these organizations and community groups getting together to say, well, we don't like that this test is being weighed so heavily, couldn't we put energies into making test prep more available and changing the culture of education so everyone does have a fair shot at things, instead of people coming from private school or whose parents may have enough money to get them ready for a 13, 14-year-old to go to Saturday mornings and getting ready to take a test that can determine if they go to Harvard and beyond. What of that? Shouldn't we be focusing our resources there and saying, why are there only 8 schools that every kid in New York wants to go to? That seems to be a larger problem than the test to get in. Why are there only 8 schools that matter?
Let me just respond to that, because I think test prep, I'm not against test prep, obviously, but I don't think that would level the playing field by itself, because the Board of Education, the Department of Education rather, has a tutorial program. It's not that large, so the admission to it is limited. But it's not comparable, I suspect, to the private
that you would pay
private ones that you pay,
tutorial.
Whatever, I don't know how much it costs. I recently, somebody told me it's, for the bar exam and other tests, it was like almost $1,000. That's a lot of money. It might be over that by now.
But no one's paying $1,000 to get their 8th grader into Stuyvesant or Brooklyn Tech, are they? Are we at that point? What tutor is that? God bless them.
It might even be more expensive than that. So that's not a solution, in my opinion. The solution is to change the admission process to include other measurements besides the test.
Yeah, and I heard you asking sort of 2 questions there. One being test prep itself, and I would say again that I think that because we don't believe that a single high-stakes test is an accurate measure of merit, that preparing students for that test is never going to be the way to go. I think you also asked a bigger question about sort of reforming the system and access in general, and having more schools matter.
No one will be able to get into the 8 schools. Like, there's only so many seats in a brick and mortar building and instruction that can happen. If 1 million kids want to get into 8 schools.
That's right, and I don't think any of the advocates involved in this complaint would disagree with that. There's sort of larger reform that needs to happen in New York City. Here's a sort of really glaring example of something that can be changed very easily.
Yep.
And that, sort of all educational experts agree is a bad idea, and it's having a really sort of glaring impact on Black and Latino students. So fix that. We're not saying don't fix anything else.
Yeah.
Don't fix, all sorts of early childhood education problems, disparities throughout the public education system in New York City. But we're saying, here's something that's sort of a glaring example of something that's wrong, that's easy to fix, and let's start there.
Point to this and see that it's broken. To that end, I have some numbers that were part of the complaint that's going in, and it said students who took the exam, these are numbers from last year. So the breakdown was African American students, and this is the test for specialized high schools in New York City. To get into one of the 8 schools, there were 6,382 African American students who took the test, and of those 6,382, 319 of them received an offer of admission to say, all right, come on over, you passed the test. And the numbers for Latinos were somewhat similar to African Americans. There were 6,143 Latino students who took the exam, and of those, 414 were offered admission. Now, looking on the other end, we go from one sort of extreme to the other. Asian Americans had the highest acceptance rate, and they also tested more slightly. 7,199 Asian American students in New York took the exam, and of that, 2,490 were offered admission. And for Caucasian students, 4,101 students took the exam, and 1,253 were offered admission into these specialized high schools. So Asian Americans, by and large, almost by half, are getting in after doing the testing. And I read one quote from a young man in Flushing who said, it's part of our culture. Everyone in Flushing, Queens, in this Asian community knows from the time they're young that you want to get into Stuyvesant. And that's something you learn with your ABCs, that you're going to be taking this test. And seems to be working in that community with 35% of the kids gaining admission. So this mindset combined with evening the sort of criteria for getting into schools may be a solution for making the playing field level for everyone. Instilling that idea you're going to take a test and you should be prepared, but also being a good student so you can gain entry as well might be a solution.
Well, I would like to start off by saying the Asian American community is not monolithic.
Right.
Joining our complaint is one South Asian organization, DRUM, and the complaint is also supported by a statement from the Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund. So I wanted to say that.
Right.
As for the culture, it being a cultural problem, what are you saying? Is there's a cultural problem a part of African American culture and Latino culture, that we are not brought up in communities or in homes that have a tradition of aspiring to go to receive a good education and wanting to go to best schools? I don't think that's true.
But the numbers bear out the fact that more Asian students are getting in than anyone else. So how is there any accounting for that?
I think there's also one thing that I think may be true, and actually, to the extent that I've studied it, is that there is all tradition of going to getting help in the Asian community. That they have schools, prep schools that give you additional help. And I think that might be a factor in it as well. I don't think it's like that they are somehow genetically or inherently more gifted.
Yeah, and I think one of the points about that you were making about monolithic communities is that the city does not keep broken down records of when they say Asian American students. We don't know what communities those are coming from. So what we understand from some of our partners is that there are some very underrepresented.
Yeah, there's an entire spectrum in the Asian community.
Exactly.
From Burma to Korea and everything in between.
Exactly, and so that that some of those smaller groups are also not doing as well with this sort of one test only group. And we really think that a change to multiple measures would level the playing field for everyone. You're still going to be rewarded for hard work, extra study, right? I mean, now a lot of kids are stuck in these test prep after schools, weekends, summers. I don't think any community is really benefiting from that. If you could refocus that energy on sort of other factors, there's nothing to keep students who are studying hard for the test now for using that energy towards schoolwork or other things that will benefit them and help them get into the schools.
So is this the civil rights issue of our time now? Everyone knows Brown v. Board of Education was a turning point for this country. Is this akin to that at the same level?
I mean, I think equal access to educational opportunity is still just as strong and as much of a problem as ever. Whether this one particular piece of it is Brown v. Board, probably not, but it's certainly a really important piece. And ensuring educational opportunity and equal access to it, I think, is still a huge civil rights issue of our time.
Well, I think that public education and access to quality education is a civil rights issue of our time, broadly speaking, and particularly because of what's happening to public schools in New York City and around the country. It seems to be like there's an effort to sort of dismantle the public education system on the part of some, with the creation, if I may say so, of so many charter schools run by private entities. So I think that public education is definitely a civil rights issue of our time. I wouldn't rank it in any respect, because I think there are others, but I think it's up there in importance.
So speaking of that historical view, the complaint is actually could be contingent on the 1964 action here in New York State about civil rights, the Civil Rights Act, the broad Civil Rights Act, and that could be what the complaint is based on, that the city could be in violation of that. So what would the ramifications be if the Department of Education was found to be in violation of that act?
That's right. So our claim is that that this policy violates Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, and that it has a disparate impact on African Americans and Latinos. So the Office for Civil Rights can come in and investigate, and they can make a finding that this is in fact in violation of Title VI. And what we are hoping would happen from there is that the city and the state would work together with the Department of Education, with the U.S. Department of Education, to come to a resolution so that the city and the state were no longer violating the civil rights laws of the country. So, you know, the policy is governed, at least in part, by state law. So, you know, we don't expect that the Office of Civil Rights is going to be able to enjoin state law. However, if they make a finding that this violates Title VI, we think that the state would act to come into, so that they were not violating Title VI anymore, and change the state law.
So we reached out to the New York City Department of Education a few times, and they sent us that lovely statement, thank you. But they are essentially saying our hands are tied. It's the state law. It's not us. The state requires that we have this one blanket thing. So how much truth is there in that? What sort of leeway does the Department of Education have with this?
I think that the Department of Education has a discretion to use other measurements like we're asking. It's true that there is a state law that requires it. And I think increasingly we're going to see advocacy around campaigns around trying to change that state law. Hopefully that will happen. But I think they have discretion. You know, it's not, and also just because something is legal don't make it right. Right.
We've seen that roll back a few times. But I don't know if I've gone too far down the road already to unpack this notion of high-stakes testing. I may have put the horse before the cart. So explain high-stakes testing to us.
I mean, I think high-stakes testing is really making big decisions based on only a test. And we see this in education a lot, although, you know, thankfully there's been a trend away from it in a lot of places. But it's exactly what you're seeing here. You take one test, and a decision about your sort of entire educational future hinges on how you do on that test. And you know, it's being used here for admissions, although it's not used in many places for admissions. But it can also be used for you know, gifted and talented programs. It can be used to determine whether or not someone graduates. All of these things are sort of high stakes, whether someone's held back.
Right. So to be clear, this isn't sort of an assessment. We hear a lot in the media, if you just hear buzz things or you glance at the headlines, that there's teaching to the test, but this isn't sort of assessments that help students gauge where they are or where they might need help. These are decision-making tests that say if you go on to these schools, not, oh, Billy needs help in reading comprehension, but he's okay with physical science or something.
That's true. And high-stake testing is a problem at other levels too. And in graduation, it affects graduation. Some of the schools have portfolios, for example, which I think is actually a good thing to do. Instead of just having your ability to graduate from high school be contingent upon whether or not you pass certain regions.
It's an entire body of
is a
work.
contingent. And so I think that there is a high-stakes testing is an issue that I think everybody should be concerned about. I was reading yesterday in the paper that some parents were planning on keeping their kids out of school for a test because the testing, you know, it's very stressful, particularly for young people. And I would include teenagers in that category.
Are stressed.
Everybody is stressed
about,
stressed. You know, and it's unnecessary too.
So moving forward then, we're here. What would your best case scenario be tomorrow morning if the department looked at this and said, you know, this is something that warrants a further investigation, or we should take a look. If you ruled the world, what would happen tomorrow to make this thing right and beneficial for the students and parents in New York City?
Sure. I mean, I would say best case scenario, the New York City Department of Education doesn't wait to hear from the Office of Civil Rights. You know, they take a look at what we've filed and say, it is within our power right now to change the policy for 5 of the 8 schools that are not governed by the state law. Only the 3 that we mentioned earlier are actually governed specifically by the state law, so they could change that policy right away.
So there are 3 schools in the city that have that specific state mandate testing. So those would be the big 3.
Yes.
Stuyvesant, our own Brooklyn Tech, and
Bronx Science. That's
over
right.
there in the Bronx.
So, but the other 5, the city could, wake up tomorrow and say,
make
you
their
know
own
what?
path.
Yeah, make their own path. And then I think that, really, if the city wants to see the state law changed, they're the only ones who actually have a stake in it. I don't see there being much resistance from the rest of the state.
Upstate, yeah.
I mean, these are city schools we're talking about. So, I think it's false that their hands are tied. I think they could, put a lot of pressure on the state. If this is what they want to see change, they can make it happen for all the schools. And, ideally they would do that sooner than later.
Are there other major metros that take into account this sort of portfolio view or different assessments outside of a high-stakes test that you guys know of?
Yes, there are. I think Texas does it for its schools, and where else? Oh, I can't think of it right now. But I wanted to add something to what Rachel said, and that was that that would be good if the Board of Education changed
And took the initiative before.
before.
Right.
But those schools are much smaller than the big 3, much smaller. The majority of the students are going to Bronx Science, Stuyvesant, Brooklyn Tech.
Right.
So, I mean, that would be good. I mean, if they increase the enrollment in those schools, although I don't want to argue the schools should be increased in size, because classes would also be increased. But I think that that's important, too, to note that those schools are really the biggest ones.
Yeah.
Sure. So if you go to our website, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund's website, it is www.naacpldf.org. And you can see an entire page there about this complaint. You can actually read the complaint as well as our backup materials and read a lot of the supporting statements, as well as there's contact info for both our organization and all the other organizations who are involved in the complaint.
And the Center for Law and
Center
Social
for Law and
Justice.
Social Justice, our website is clsj.org. We're also on Facebook and Twitter if you want to follow us.
So there you go. You can get them on Facebook, Twitter, all over the internet. I'd like to thank my guests, Joan P. Gibbs from the Center for Law and Social Justice at Medgar Evers College, and Rachel Kleinman from the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. Thanks for watching Intersect. Bye now.
Watch this and other Brooklyn Independent Television episodes online at breakartsmedia.org/BIT.